You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
So it was about 50 years ago that Marvel Comics introduced the character of the Watcher, whose job was to ask, what if? The first question asked was, what if Spider-Man joined the Fantastic Four? Later questions would say, what if Doctor Doom was a hero? Or what if the Hulk ended up killing Wolverine in their climactic battle? If I remember correctly, most of the stories told in What If would end in world-ending or sometimes universe-ending calamity. But it's also a fun question to ask ourselves, even in our more mundane, less than superheroic lives. What if I dropped out of high school and never went to college? What if I never moved to California? What if I never bought a comic book when I was 9 years old and stopped asking questions like this? The world might be a very different place. Sometimes the smallest decisions at the time turn out to have major consequences that we could not expect. Sometimes saying yes shapes our future and the future of others as well. Our text today is one of those small decisions, but has such a consequential impact. It's Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your birthplace and your family to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great so that your name will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. And when they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. And at the time the Canaanites were in the land, and then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So this passage is the first time in Scripture that we are introduced to a man who will eventually be called the father of three faiths, central to the origins and the shape of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And the remainder of Genesis will carry us through the ups and downs of Abram's life as well as the life of his kids and grandkids. But as we start, there's not much to go on here. It's kind of a boring passage. What on earth am I going to do with this? But I've found in this passage, the call of Abram, an essential part of my understanding of what it means to be a church, what the point of our faith is, and why we are called together to do God's work. And we get a little bit of that glimpse further ahead in the book of Galatians, as the Apostle Paul is reflecting on how the churches in the Roman Empire are meant to be shaped not only by the story of Jesus, but by the story of their ancestors. And what Paul will say is that this moment is the gospel given in advance. 2,000 years before Christ, God's gospel was shared in this call of Abraham. To understand Paul's claim, we need to kind of understand where this passage fits in the story. Last week, we were in Genesis 1. Now we're in 12. Some things happened along the way. In fact, we might call chapters 1 through 11 more of a prologue, a setup for the real story that's going to happen as we start in chapter 12. But in the second creation account, we didn't talk about that one in Genesis 2 very much. But what we find in the second creation account is an introduction to Adam and Eve, their temptation by a serpent in the garden, and their children Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother over how they would define appropriate sacrifices to God, what it means to truly worship God. In a few generations, as the world is collapsing in violence, which leads to this flood that Noah will then build an ark and find rescue from, God reboots the whole endeavor. And after that, things are going okay for a while, until humanity decides to ignore God's invitation to be fruitful and multiply. Instead, they all collapse to the city of Babel, where they seek to build a tower that could reach even to the heavens. Now, these stories, of course, are fables, likely oral histories that would be shared around campfires, that would form the imagination of Israel's origins. And the way that they are told And the way that they are assembled in this prologue of Genesis actually is sort of a fanciful retelling of Israel's history up to that point. Forced out of not Eden, but the promised land because they disobeyed God, and specifically in God's care for the poor and the widow and the orphan and the stranger. How they would fight with their siblings about the correct ways to worship, the where and the whens and the hows. About the violence and war that they couldn't seem to be rescued from. And finally, their confusion in the city of Babel, although by this time it's called Babylon. But you get it. If we read Genesis as a text written after the exile, as the people try to make sense of who they were and who are they becoming, as they've been stripped for their land, as Jerusalem's been destroyed, the temple no longer exists, and they wonder that if they get back, will God even be there for them? Then this story, up to this point at least, tells them exactly who they are. You are cursed. Cain, Noah, Babel, all of this. You guys can't seem to get it. And so Paul says, some good news is needed. We need a gospel then, not 2,000 years later. And so God will set aside Abram, a man from the city of Ur. This city would be familiar to its first readers as a major city outside of Babylon that still existed. And then Abram would move to Haran, settling there. Haran would be known as a place for centuries where the worship of a moon god was as prominent as anything else, so prominent that by the time the final king of Babylon was on the throne, this moon god was considered the chief of all deities. And so when the exiles are leaving Babylon, they are told a story of a man from Babylon worshiping the Babylonian god who hears Yahweh speak to him. Anyone reading Genesis and feeling the least bit unfit for belonging within the ways of God would find Abram to be just like them. Anyone who would imagine there's no way that I would belong in a temple, a synagogue, a church, a mosque, anywhere where faith might be found, Abram is the promise of good news to them. Anyone who would say, I'm not welcome because I'm foreign born, I've worshiped other gods, I'm stuck between lands that I can call myself home, I'm not welcome here, would find their welcome in Abram. And so Yahweh speaks, and Abram responds. Yahweh says, go, and Abram does. Curse after curse of an unfaithful people who knew God as creator, and now some random outsider gets it? It could have been anyone that God spoke to. And that's the point. Because Abram's faithfulness will be enough to remake a people toward faith. Yahweh says, go from your country and your birthplace and your family and all that is familiar, all that identifies you as you, to a place that I will show you, away from anyone that could claim you as their own, claim you as the place where you are safe, any place that would make you who you are. God says, leave that behind, and with it, leave the curses too. And so back to the creation story, we see a God who will speak into nothing and make something. And so we see it again here, forming a nation from a nobody. Because after all that Abram stands to lose, the promise of God says, in the end, you'll get everything. I will make the greatest nation from you. Later on, he'll say, as vast as the sand is on the shore, so will your people be. As the countless stars in the sky will be your descendants. When Jesus calls his disciples to leave everything in their boats to follow him, when we hear stories of those life-changing acts of faith where we set off into the unknown and God comes through, we find ourselves stepping into that same calling of Abram. No longer a people known by a curse, they are to be a blessing, a conduit for God to bless the world through their faithfulness. And in this is where I suspect we can find what it means to be a church, as a people of faith united together in this simple calling, go and be a blessing. I think there's no greater step of faith than that. That this is what will mark the people of God, blessings and not borders. It's a teaching essential to Jesus, that we would move along the lives of those who are counted as cursed and instead show them that they are loved and that they are belonged. So 3 years ago, we stepped out in faith, following God to say that we are an open and affirming congregation, people who support and celebrate the LGBTQ community. And I don't think any of us, including me, would have imagined that as a result, we would host an annual Pride event in the park across the street. I didn't have that in my imagination. And yet, we said yes. You ever get an invite to a party that you don't want to go to? And then maybe someone you love says, no, we're going, put your shoes on. And you kick and scream and complain on the way there. But having shown up out of your comfort zone because you had to put on a belt, now you're grateful for it. You found a new friend. You've been able to start a conversation with a new neighbor. That in all these ways that we are called to leave our life of comfort and security and safety and go into the unknown and talk to someone we've never met before, whose life doesn't look anything like ours, and suddenly we find, hey, wait a minute, God is there too. And we begin to see what it means to be a blessing. That often when we seek to be a blessing, we're the ones that are blessed. When we leave what we think is safe, we find a greater community of welcome and embrace. The call is repeated throughout Genesis. Abram's name is later changed to Abraham when he is reminded of the promise. He's given a chance like, hey man, if you don't want to do this, I get it. And Abram says, no, let's stick with this. That promise is later given and invited to his children and grandchildren, and as I would imagine it, every descendant of Abram that has existed, including us. Not by blood, but by faith. To go and be a blessing. Going for you might mean out your front door. It might mean across the street, across the country, across the world. But wherever you go, you seek to be a blessing. Not to hoard the wealth of faith and hope and love for ourselves so that we can amass the comfort and security we want here on earth and into the heaven to come, but instead we pour ourselves out just as Christ would do. To go toward the unknown, to the unclean, to the unwelcome, and say, what would good news look like for them? What would blessing be for them? It's probably going to be something along the ideas of you're loved unconditionally by God, called and invited unconditionally by God, just as the way that God called Abraham. Nothing that he did deserved it or earned it, and yet he was seen and called out by God. How can we, as Christ would say, hear the call to go and make disciples of every nation, to break down borders and instead be united as a people by the blessing that God has given us? How might we embody the good news in all that we do? That's a what-if question worth asking. Amen.